The pandemic has highlighted persistent struggle against the ever-increasing demand for burial space. This problem has forced major cities to find a balance between providing accommodation for the living and the dead. Now, to further discuss this, we're joined via Skype by Pepe Dass, who's the South African Cemeteries Association, from the South African Cemeteries Association. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to you.
All right, so for as long as I can remember, burial space has always been a problem.
That's right. We've been going through this for many years now. I suppose the pandemic is bringing about a focus to the challenges we face that may not have been catching the public eye as much it has in the past. But I think, to put things into perspective, the number of deaths that we're experiencing at this point in time as a result of the pandemic is not exacerbating the challenge. The challenge in terms of the population demands and mortality with regards to the population size we have in this country. That's the actual challenge in terms of trying to find the grave sites and the grave space to accommodate that. Our numbers in terms of fatality with regards to the pandemic at this point in time is too small to raise the spike in demand,
All right, so what the pandemic perhaps is warning us is that there could be an even bigger problem in the near future. But at this stage, it's a problem that is really a function of the increased population and, dare I say, growing population of elderly. Who is responsible for providing burial space?
Look, the mandate for cemeteries and the provision of the service is both largely local government and to a certain extent, provincial government. But it falls mostly on local government to provide that cemetery space and cemetery development. Unfortunately, we can't blame government if there's a challenge in terms of finding a local government, if there's a challenge in finding the space, because space is very finite. It's not something that grows, it just exists. And it's the way we choose to use that space and how sustainable we make our use of the space that will allow us to basically reuse. Once we put into practices, once we practice, the use of space in an unsustainable way, then it becomes a limiting factor, to us. So if we bury, for example, in ways that could allow us to reuse the space, in other words, reuse graves, bury a body or bury more than a body in a grave by using that particular grave on different occasions, which is a practice that already happens in many parts of the country, where families, for that matter, may bury in the same grave. Parents may go into that grave, and later on, their children may use the same grave, etc. So that practice is already in place, and it's not an uncommon thing, but it makes the use of the space more sustainable. Of course, now this has to happen on a large scale, where we have to limit the use of single graves. So there has to be perhaps a time limit on how long a grave stay reserved to somebody. Otherwise we would have graves being reserved indefinitely to people, which basically lock up the space, and that's something that cannot happen in the future.
I would imagine one of the challenges that you'd have is cultural practices. We all come from different backgrounds, and for some it's just unthinkable, the suggestion that you're making.
Yes, it is. It's a severe challenge, culturally. But when one really scrutinizes culture and really looks into history, you'd find that culture has adapted to to environmental circumstances. So if things become very difficult, one changes, and culture changes to allow people to adapt, because ultimately survival is what's most important. And right now we see that sort of phenomena in countries that have severe challenges with space. The challenges are a lot more difficult than the ones that we are facing in South Africa. But that's not to say we are not going to face the same challenge. Our populations are growing. But in European countries, Spain, Italy, England, the challenges are huge, and over a period of time, they've adapted. Now, culturally, the Italians vary, and so do the Spaniards, and they've tried to keep that culture, intact by burying above ground in structures that we call mausolea. But even in terms of creating the spaces above ground, they faced a challenge. Those mausolea have become full, and they've had to find ways to remove the remains in those mausolea that may have been lying there for 50 or even longer, and return them to the families, or even cremate those remains so that they can reuse those facilities. So the challenge is actually space, whether it's in the ground or above ground, and how one uses that space. In the UK, cremation some years ago was a serious challenge, and to accept, and now 70 somewhat % of the Britons cremate.
Wow.
The US also a very conservative society that would bury, and around early 2000, I think the statistics indicated about 13 or 14% of the US population would move to cremation. But in recent years, the numbers increased to about 50, just under 60%. Okay. So it shows, populations are changing, even though they are culturally challenged, in order to cope with the spatial difficulties. I don't think it can be any different for us in Africa, for that matter, as much as currently that we would cling to certain cultural issues. I think what needs to happen is that when one looks at your culture, look at what the value systems are within the culture that you retain, and that's the most important aspect of it. The memory of ancestors, etc., is something that may not necessarily tie in with whether the body is in the ground or how remains are treated.
All right, I think that is a fair point, and perhaps something that we have to interrogate as a society, and we've seen these changes in other parts of the world. Let's hope that we start to think differently as well. But thanks so much indeed for talking to us and sharing your thoughts with us on the program.
Thank you very much. I think it's really important to keep this discussion going.
Thank you so much. All right, that was Pepe Dass from the South African Cemeteries Association talking to us about COVID-19, not yet a major factor in the challenges of burial space, but it could be in the near future. Now, how